The sheriff had come to arrest the widow before sunrise, but the moment he stepped onto her porch and looked through the open doorway, he slowly removed his hat and stood in complete silence. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The deputies waiting behind him exchanged confused looks. They had ridden nearly 12 miles, believing they were coming to arrest a dangerous woman, accused of stealing cattle from 3 neighboring ranches. Instead, their sheriff stood motionless, staring into the small cabin, as though he had forgotten why he had come. Whatever he had seen inside had changed everything. The widow did not ask him to leave. She did not defend herself. She simply stood beside the old wooden table, with both hands resting on its worn edge, waiting for him to decide what kind of man he truly was. No one in Cedar Hollow understood how a woman like Eleanor Hayes had become the most talked-about person in the county. 3 years earlier, she had buried her husband after a harsh winter fever swept through the valley. 6 months later, drought claimed nearly everything the family had built together. One by one, neighbors packed their wagons and moved away, chasing better land farther west. Eleanor stayed, not because the farm still promised a future, because leaving would have meant abandoning the only place where her husband and little daughter were buried beneath 2 weathered cedar trees overlooking the creek. Every morning before sunrise, she carried fresh water to the graves. Every evening, she returned with fresh wildflowers whenever she could find them. The people of Cedar Hollow respected her determination. They also worried about her. Running a farm alone was difficult enough for any person. For a widow with no family nearby, it seemed nearly impossible. Still, she never asked for help. That alone made people admire her and misunderstand her. When fences collapsed after spring storms, she repaired them herself. When the roof leaked, she climbed onto it with hammer and nails. When her mule became sick, she walked 10 miles to buy medicine instead of borrowing money she could never repay. People noticed. Some called her stubborn. Others called her proud. Neither description was completely true. She simply refused to survive by asking others to carry burdens she believed were hers. That quiet strength earned respect from honest people. It also attracted resentment from dishonest ones. Across the valley stood the largest ranch in the county. Nathan Crowley owned nearly every acre surrounding Cedar Hollow. He had spent 20 years buying struggling farms one after another, until few families remained independent. There was only one property he had never managed to purchase: Eleanor's. Twice he offered generous payment. Twice she politely refused. The third time, he smiled as though the answer no longer mattered. From that day forward, strange things began happening around her farm. A water barrel disappeared. 2 horses escaped during the night after someone cut the gate rope. Fence posts were pulled from the ground. Tools vanished without explanation. Nothing valuable enough to involve the sheriff, just enough to make life harder. Eleanor replaced what she lost and kept working. She refused to complain. She refused to accuse anyone without proof. She believed truth had a way of revealing itself if given enough time. Not everyone shared that patience. One cloudy afternoon, 3 ranchers rode into town claiming several of their cattle had disappeared. Fresh tracks led toward the northern hills. Hours later, someone reported seeing similar cattle grazing near Eleanor's pasture. The story spread through Cedar Hollow before sunset. By morning, it had become something far more dangerous than gossip. People were no longer asking whether the widow had stolen cattle. They were asking why she had finally done it. Some believed loneliness had broken her spirit. Others whispered that hunger could make honest people desperate. No one bothered asking Eleanor what had actually happened. Rumors often traveled faster than truth, especially in small towns. Sheriff Thomas Calloway had served Cedar Hollow for almost 15 years. He had arrested horse thieves, bank robbers, drifters, even murderers. Yet one rule had guided every decision. Never arrest a person because of what others believed. Only arrest them because of what could be proven. When Nathan Crowley personally walked into the sheriff's office carrying sworn statements from 3 respected ranchers, Thomas listened carefully. The evidence appeared convincing. Fresh hoofprints, missing cattle, witnesses, enough for a formal investigation, enough to bring Eleanor in for questioning. But something about the case felt unusually clean. Too clean. Real crimes usually left confusion behind. This one seemed almost perfectly arranged. That thought stayed with him all night. Before sunrise, he saddled his horse anyway. Because the law required questions before answers, not assumptions before justice. As the first light spread across the valley, Sheriff Calloway and 2 deputies reached the lonely farmhouse. Smoke drifted gently from the chimney. Someone was already awake. The sheriff tied his horse to the old fence and walked toward the porch. Before he could knock, he heard a small voice inside. "Grandma, are the men coming today?" The sheriff stopped. Eleanor answered softly, "Yes, sweetheart." "Will they take us away?" A long silence followed. Then came words so quiet that only a man standing inches from the door could hear them. "I do not know." Sheriff Thomas slowly placed his hand on the doorknob. One more step, and everything he believed about this case was about to change. Sheriff Thomas rested his hand on the doorknob, but did not push it open immediately. He had arrested hardened criminals without hesitation. Yet something about the frightened voice of that little girl made him pause. One slow breath later, he knocked. Eleanor opened the door before he could knock again. She had already guessed why he had come. Her face carried no anger, no fear. Only the quiet exhaustion of someone who had spent too many years fighting battles alone. "Good morning, Sheriff." His deputies stepped onto the porch behind him, expecting handcuffs to appear at any moment. Instead, Thomas remained where he stood. "I need to ask you some questions." She nodded once. "You had better come inside. The child is frightened enough already." The sheriff entered. His deputies followed. The cabin was smaller than he remembered. Everything inside was spotless. Every chair repaired. Every blanket carefully folded. Every shelf organized with the care of someone who owned very little and appreciated every piece of it. Nothing suggested stolen wealth. Nothing suggested greed. Only hard work. Near the fireplace sat a little girl, perhaps 7 years old, hugging a worn cloth rabbit, whose stitching had been repaired so many times it barely resembled the toy it once had been. She looked at the sheriff with wide eyes. "Are you taking Grandma away?" Thomas did not answer immediately. He simply knelt until he was at her height. "What is your name?" "Emily." "And how long have you lived here with your grandmother?" "Since Mama died." Her answer settled heavily inside the room. Thomas looked toward Eleanor. "You never mentioned your granddaughter." No one asked. Another silence followed. His deputies exchanged uncertain glances. The woman standing before them did not look like the thief described in town. She looked like someone carrying more responsibility than one person should. Still, feelings were not evidence. Thomas straightened. "I have reports that several missing cattle were found near your property." "I expected that." One deputy frowned. "You expected it?" Eleanor walked toward the window overlooking the pasture. "Because someone wanted them there." The sheriff watched her carefully. "You sound certain." "I am." "Can you prove it?" She looked back at him. "No." Her honesty surprised him. Most guilty people searched desperately for excuses. Eleanor simply admitted what she could not prove. Thomas stepped outside with her. The morning sun had finally reached the fields. Several brown cattle grazed peacefully beyond the fence. His deputy counted quietly. 6. Exactly the number reported missing. The sheriff climbed over the fence and walked toward them. Something caught his attention almost immediately. The cattle were calm. Too calm. Animals stolen during the night usually remained restless for days after being moved. These showed no fear, almost as though they had wandered here willingly. He crouched beside fresh hoofprints pressed into the damp earth. They all pointed in one direction, toward Eleanor's pasture. His deputy smiled confidently. "Looks clear enough." Thomas remained silent. Then he noticed another set of tracks, almost hidden beneath the larger prints. Boot marks. Deep, deliberate. the kind left by a man walking slowly rather than chasing livestock. He followed them several yards. They stopped beside a broken section of fencing. The sheriff touched the splintered wood. Fresh break. Less than a day old. He looked back toward Eleanor. When did this fence break? Yesterday afternoon. Why did you not repair it? I was repairing the roof after the storm. Thomas glanced upward. Sure enough, several new wooden shingles reflected brighter than the older roof. She had been telling the truth. One deputy crossed his arms. Even so, the cattle crossed through here. They did. But someone made certain they could. The deputy frowned. You are defending her. I am examining facts. Thomas continued studying the ground. The boot prints returned toward the road, not toward Eleanor's barn. Not toward her house, toward the main trail leading directly back to town. That troubled him. If Eleanor had stolen the cattle herself, why would another person be walking away afterward? Before he could answer the question, another rider approached at full speed. Nathan Crowley. The wealthy ranch owner slowed his horse near the pasture and removed one leather glove with practiced confidence. I heard you found my cattle. We found the cattle, Thomas replied evenly. Crowley smiled. I suppose that settles the matter. Not yet. The smile faded slightly. I thought the evidence was obvious. Thomas looked across the field once more. Sometimes the obvious answer is the wrong one. Crowley's expression hardened almost invisibly. Eleanor Hayes has resisted selling her land for years. That has nothing to do with this investigation. Perhaps. Crowley shrugged. But people become desperate. Eleanor said nothing. She simply stood beside Emily, resting one protective hand on the little girl's shoulder. Thomas noticed something strange. Crowley never looked at the child, not once. He spoke only to the sheriff, only about the land, never about justice. That small detail stayed with Thomas. People seeking justice usually spoke about victims. People protecting themselves often spoke about property. Before Thomas could continue, Emily suddenly tugged on her grandmother's sleeve. Grandma. Eleanor looked down. What is it? The red ribbon. What about it? Emily pointed toward the cattle. The pretty red ribbon is gone. Thomas turned immediately. Red ribbon? Emily nodded. The cow with the white face had one yesterday. The sheriff's eyes narrowed. He slowly looked across the herd again. Every animal carried a normal ranch brand, but not a single ribbon. Someone had removed it. Recently, the morning breeze carried only silence across the pasture. Then Thomas noticed something else. A tiny strip of red cloth caught beneath a broken fence nail, fluttering softly in the wind. He walked toward it without saying a word. Crowley's face lost its color for the first time that morning. And the sheriff suddenly realized someone had made one very small mistake. Sheriff Thomas carefully pulled the small piece of red ribbon free from the broken fence. It was caught tightly around the rusted nail, as though someone had torn it away while passing through in a hurry. He turned it over in his fingers. The cloth was clean, far too clean to have been hanging outside for long. He looked toward Emily. Are you certain this came from one of the cattle? The little girl nodded without hesitation. The white-faced cow wore it yesterday. Grandma said somebody must have loved her once. Thomas looked at Eleanor. You tied the ribbon. She shook her head. No. Then who did? I have never seen that ribbon before yesterday. Crowley laughed softly from behind them. A child remembers ribbons now. Sheriff, surely we are not building a case around children's stories. Thomas did not answer. Instead, he handed the ribbon to one of his deputies. Keep this. The deputy looked confused. For what? Because somebody removed it. And? Thomas looked back at the pasture. People remove things when they are hiding something. Crowley folded his arms. You already found my cattle. I found cattle. There is no difference. Thomas finally met his eyes. There is always a difference. The wealthy rancher forced another smile, but this one never reached his eyes. Thomas had seen that expression before. Not on innocent men. On gamblers who knew the next card might ruin them. The sheriff walked slowly around the pasture. Every step revealed something new. Fresh hoofprints. broken grass, loose dirt. Then he stopped beside the water trough. Something floated against the wooden edge. A small leather glove. He picked it up. It was expensive. Far finer than anything Eleanor could afford. Inside the cuff were neatly stitched initials, N.C. Nathan Crowley. One deputy looked stunned. Crowley stepped forward immediately. "I have workers. It could belong to anyone." Thomas nodded calmly. "It could." He slipped the glove into his saddlebag. "We will find out." For the first time that morning, Crowley stopped speaking. Thomas spent the rest of the morning examining every inch of the property. He checked gates, fence posts, water barrels, tracks leading toward the hills. Most people believed investigations were solved by dramatic discoveries. Thomas knew better. Truth usually revealed itself one small piece at a time. By noon, another strange detail appeared. The hoofprints entering Eleanor's pasture matched 6 cattle. The hoofprints leaving it matched only 4. Thomas counted again. Still 4. His deputy frowned. "How is that possible?" "It is not." Thomas continued studying the trail. Unless the trail was made before the cattle ever arrived. The deputy looked puzzled. Thomas pointed toward the ground. "Notice the rain." The deputy stared blankly. "It rained yesterday afternoon." "Yes." Thomas nodded. "These 4 tracks were made before the storm." He pointed farther ahead. The 6 tracks crossing into the pasture were made after it. The deputy slowly understood. So someone brought the cattle here after yesterday's rain." The deputy looked toward Eleanor. It means somebody wanted us to find them here." Meanwhile, Eleanor returned to repairing the broken fence. She did not interrupt the investigation. She simply worked, board after board, hammer strike after hammer strike. Emily gathered the fallen nails into a small tin cup. Thomas watched them quietly. Most people accused of theft spent their time inventing excuses. Eleanor spent hers fixing the damage someone else had caused. The difference mattered. More than most people realized. Late that afternoon, another rider approached the farm. Old Samuel Briggs, the oldest rancher in Cedar Hollow. He removed his hat respectfully before speaking. "Sheriff," Thomas nodded. "Samuel." The old rancher looked toward Eleanor with concern. "I heard what happened. So did half the county." Samuel sighed. "That is usually the problem." He reached into his saddlebag. "I almost forgot." He unfolded a weathered piece of cloth. Another red ribbon, exactly like the one Thomas had found. Emily's eyes widened. "That is it." Samuel smiled gently. "My granddaughter ties these ribbons around gentle cattle during the spring fair." Thomas looked carefully at the ribbon. "Where did this come from?" Samuel pointed toward Crowley's ranch. "I sold 3 ribbon sets to Nathan's foreman last week." Silence settled over the field. Crowley owned ribbons exactly like the one found on Eleanor's broken fence. Thomas slowly turned toward the wealthy rancher. Crowley's jaw tightened. "There is nothing illegal about buying ribbons." "No," Thomas agreed. "There is not. But it is interesting." The sheriff mounted his horse. "I think it is time we visited your ranch." Crowley forced a laugh. "You believe I planted my own cattle." "I believe someone did. And you think that someone is me." "I think someone is lying." Crowley's confidence began to crack. Very slightly. Almost invisibly. But Thomas noticed. Good sheriffs always noticed. As they rode toward Crowley's ranch, one of the deputies finally spoke. "Do you really think Eleanor is innocent?" Thomas kept his eyes on the trail ahead. "I stopped deciding guilt hours ago." "What are you deciding now?" "The truth." The deputy rode in silence for several moments. Then he asked the question that had been bothering him since sunrise. "If she is innocent." Thomas finished the sentence himself. "Then someone has been trying very hard to destroy her." The sheriff tightened the reins. Because one question still had no answer. If Nathan Crowley had planned everything, why? Stealing 6 cattle could never force Eleanor to sell her land. There had to be a much bigger reason. And Thomas intended to find it before another innocent life was destroyed. The road to Nathan Crowley's ranch stretched across nearly 2 miles of dry prairie. No one spoke during the ride. Sheriff Thomas had learned long ago that guilty people often became nervous in silence. Innocent people usually welcomed it. As they reached the main gate, Crowley forced a smile. "You are welcome to search wherever you like." Thomas climbed down from his horse. "I intend to." The ranch was larger than any other property in Cedar Hollow. Workers moved hay. Stable hands watered horses. Everything appeared orderly, almost too orderly. Thomas slowly walked through the main barn. Fresh hay, clean stalls, well-fed horses. Nothing unusual. Then he noticed something tucked behind a stack of grain sacks. A pair of muddy boots. He picked one up. The sole matched the unusual boot prints he had seen beside Eleanor's broken fence. He compared the pattern carefully. Every cut, every worn edge, every missing nail, an exact match. Crowley's foreman stepped forward. "Those are mine." Thomas looked at him. "Were you on Eleanor Hayes' property yesterday?" "No." "You are certain?" "I never left this ranch." Thomas quietly handed the boot to his deputy. "Interesting." The foreman suddenly looked less confident. Thomas continued deeper into the barn. Near the rear wall stood an old storage room. Its wooden door was locked. "What is inside?" Crowley answered quickly. "Old equipment. I would like to see it." "There is nothing important." Thomas looked directly into his eyes. "If there is nothing important, then opening the door should not concern you." Crowley hesitated, only for a second. But it was enough. The sheriff noticed. Slowly, Crowley handed over the key. The door creaked open. Inside were broken wagon wheels, rusted tools, and empty grain barrels. At first glance, everything looked ordinary. Then Thomas noticed a folded survey map lying across an old table. He opened it. It showed the entire Cedar Hollow Valley. Several farms had been marked with black ink. Almost every marked property had already been purchased by Nathan Crowley. Only one remained unmarked. Eleanor Hayes' farm. At the bottom of the map was another document. A letter from a railroad company. Thomas unfolded it carefully, his eyes narrowed. The proposed railroad line would pass directly through Eleanor's land. Any owner willing to sell would receive a fortune. Crowley had known about the railroad for months. No one else in town had. Suddenly, everything made sense. Crowley never wanted the cattle, he wanted the land. If Eleanor were arrested for cattle theft, she would lose her reputation. Without money for lawyers, and with the town believing she was a thief, she would eventually be forced to sell the farm for almost nothing. Then Crowley could buy it and sell it to the railroad for many times its value. It had never been about revenge. It had never been about stolen cattle. It had always been about greed. Thomas slowly folded the letter. "When were you planning to tell the town?" Crowley remained silent. "When the railroad arrived." Still nothing. The sheriff placed both documents inside his saddlebag. "I believe our investigation is finished." Crowley finally spoke. "You cannot prove I moved those cattle." Thomas looked toward the foreman. "I might not have to." The foreman lowered his eyes. Sweat rolled slowly down his forehead. Thomas had seen that look many times. A man protecting someone else. Until he realized he was protecting the wrong person. The sheriff spoke calmly. "You have one opportunity to tell the truth." The foreman swallowed hard. Crowley interrupted. "Say nothing." That was the mistake. Thomas immediately turned toward the deputy. "Arrest Nathan Crowley for attempting to interfere with an active investigation." "What?" Crowley stepped backward. "You cannot arrest me. I already have." The deputies moved quickly. Within seconds, Crowley's hands were secured behind his back. His confident smile had completely disappeared. The foreman watched silently. Then he sighed. "I moved the cattle." No one spoke. "I cut Eleanor's fence." His voice shook. Mr. Crowley said no one would get hurt. Thomas remained silent. The foreman continued. "He promised me enough money to buy my own farm." "And the ribbon?" "My daughter tied one around the white-faced cow during the spring fair. I forgot to remove it." Thomas closed his eyes for a brief moment. One forgotten ribbon. That tiny mistake had unraveled the entire plan. 2 days later, the people of Cedar Hollow gathered outside the church. Word of the truth had spread faster than the original rumors. One by one, neighbors approached Eleanor. Some apologized. Others simply lowered their heads in shame. She accepted every apology with quiet grace. Not because they deserved forgiveness, because carrying bitterness would only create another burden. Samuel Briggs walked over with a toolbox. "I believe your barn still needs repairing." Another rancher smiled. "I brought lumber." A blacksmith raised his hand. "I will fix your wagon." Soon, nearly half the town had joined in. By sunset, the broken fence had been rebuilt. The leaking roof was repaired. The old well had a new hand pump. Children laughed across the yard while Emily chased chickens with the cloth rabbit tucked under one arm. For the first time in many months, the farm sounded alive again. Before leaving, Sheriff Thomas walked quietly toward the 2 cedar trees overlooking the creek. He removed his hat, not because the law required it, because respect did. Eleanor joined him. "I never thanked you." Thomas smiled gently. "You do not owe me thanks. You believed me." He shook his head. "No." She looked surprised. "I simply refused to believe a rumor before I believed the truth code." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The evening wind moved gently through the cedar branches. Emily ran toward them laughing, holding a handful of wildflowers. She carefully placed them beside the 2 small graves. Thomas looked at Eleanor. "I think this land has been waiting for happier days." A faint smile appeared on her face. "So have we." The sheriff placed his hat back on his head and walked toward his horse. As he rode away, he looked back one last time. The same porch where he had arrived expecting to arrest a widow had become the place where he was reminded that justice was never about making quick decisions. It was about having the courage to wait for the truth.